The sharp crack of the whip sliced through the Wyoming wind. I watched from the porch as Leo, my 12-year-old son, struck the frightened foal again. Any normal mother would have sprinted down the steps, terrified for her child's soul. I didn't. I just stood there, gripping the wooden rail, feeling nothing but a hollow, freezing disgust. How could a woman who would gladly bleed for this ranch not find a single drop of love for the boy she carried in her own womb? The Thorn Ranch stretches across 50,000 acres of unbroken Wyoming wilderness. It is an empire built on cattle, dirt, and blood. My great-grandfather carved it out of the rock. I inherited it. Running this place requires a heart made of barbed wire. You don't survive the winters here with sentiment. You survive with calculation. I manage the herds. And I balance the ledgers. I negotiate the land leases. I am the steel spine of this operation. People respect me, but they do not love me. They love Julian, my husband. He is the perfect picture of the American cowboy, tall, broad-shouldered, with a smile that could melt the frost off a January morning. When he walks into the local feed store in town, men tip their hats and women blush. He remembers everyone's name. He buys the first round at the tavern. They look at us and whisper about how lucky I am, how his warmth thaws my coldness. He is the mediator, the charming, accessible face of the Thorn Empire, and he is the perfect father. Or so it seems. When Leo acts out, when he shows that streak of absolute cruelty, Julian is always there to soften the blow. Like yesterday, after the incident with the foal. I wanted Leo disciplined, so I wanted him mucking out the lower stalls for a month. Julian just put a heavy, warm hand on my shoulder. Let it go, Victoria. He is just a boy learning the ropes. He has a lot of fire in him. We just need to guide it. Don't be so hard on him. It is always the same script. Julian plays the understanding savior. I play the tyrant. He builds his relationship with the boy by systematically undermining my authority. Last night, the real agenda surfaced. We were in my study. The room is paneled in dark oak. The walls are lined with topographical maps of the property. Julian poured himself a glass of bourbon. The ice clinked against the crystal. He sat in the leather chair across from my desk. He looked at me with those earnest, clear blue eyes. Victoria, we need to talk about the trust, Leo's trust fund. And I kept my eyes on the ledger in front of me. We already funded it, Julian. He has enough cash to buy half the county when he turns 18. Julian leaned forward. The charm faded just a fraction. It was replaced by a look of deep, fatherly concern. It is not about the cash, Victoria. It is about security. The climate is changing. The droughts are getting longer. I want you to transfer the prime water rights into his name, the Lower Basin Reservoir. I stopped writing. The pen hovered over the paper. The Lower Basin Reservoir is the lifeblood of the Thorn Ranch. In Wyoming, land without water is just dust. Whoever controls the Lower Basin controls the entire 50,000 acres. It is the one asset my father told me never to sign away. Not to a partner, not to a bank, and certainly not to a 12-year-old boy. And that is the core of the ranch, Julian. It stays in my name until I am dead. He sighed, a long, suffering sigh. Victoria, you are being paranoid again. It is for our son. Don't you want to guarantee his future? What if something happens to the business? If the rights are in his trust, they are protected, untouchable. I am just trying to look out for our family. You always see enemies where there are none. He stood up. He walked over and kissed the top of my head, a gesture of dominance disguised as affection. Just think about it, honey. Have the lawyers draft the papers for Leo. He left the room. The door clicked shut. I looked at the maps on the wall, the thick blue lines marking the rivers and reservoirs. Transferring those rights would effectively strip me of my power. It would hand the reins of the empire over to a trust. A trust that Julian, as the father and legal guardian, would inevitably manage until Leo came of age. I stared at the closed door. Numbers never lie. Motives do. I didn't feel anger. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. The beloved cowboy wasn't just playing the good father. He was making a calculated play for the throne. And he was using a 12-year-old boy as his shield. The dirt in the lower yard was still kicked up. Elias, our foreman, stood by the wooden fence. His jaw was tight. His 9-year-old son, Toby, was crying by the water trough. A fresh, angry red welt marked the side of the boy's neck, a rope burn. I walked over. My boots crunched heavily on the gravel. "What happened here, Elias?" He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the main house. "It was Leo, Mrs. Thorne. He thought it was funny to practice his roping on Toby, and he dragged him a few yards through the dirt before I caught him." I looked at the welt on the child's neck. I felt my jaw lock. "Take him to the kitchen. Have Maria put ice on it immediately. I will handle Leo." I found my son in the tack room. He was sitting on an overturned barrel. He was casually polishing a silver riding spur. He didn't even look up when I pushed the heavy wooden door open. "Put that down, Leo." He kept rubbing the silver with a dirty rag. "I am busy." I stepped forward. I snatched the rag and the spur from his hands. I threw them onto the floor. The metal clattered sharply against the wood. "Look at me when I speak to you. You drag the foreman's son with a rope. You treat the people on this ranch like animals." He rolled his eyes. They were the exact same shade of pale blue as Julian's. He was in my way. "It was just a joke. He is a crybaby anyway." "You are grounded for a full month. No riding, no going into town. You will clean the lower stalls every morning before school until your hands blister." "You can't do that." "I just did." The door creaked open behind me. Julian stood in the frame. The afternoon sun cast a long shadow from his Stetson. He took off the hat. He stepped between me and the boy, the eternal shield, the great mediator. "Whoa, let's calm down. Victoria, what is going on here?" "Your son decided to rope Toby like a calf. He injured him. I am giving him the exact punishment he earned." Julian looked at Leo. He placed a heavy, warm hand on the boy's shoulder. He didn't yell. He never yelled. He just sighed. "Go to your room, Leo. Let me talk to your mother." Leo smirked at me. A quick, victorious twitch of the lips. And he walked out. We were alone. The smell of old leather and dust hung heavy in the air. Julian leaned against the saddle rack. He crossed his arms. He looked at me with an expression of profound pity. It was worse than anger. "Why do you always do this, Victoria?" "Do what?" "Discipline a child who acts like a thug on my property." "You attack him. You never try to understand him. He is 12 years old. He makes mistakes. But the way you look at him, it is freezing. It is like you are looking at a stranger." I stood my ground. "I look at his actions, Julian. I look at the facts." He shook his head. He stepped closer. His voice dropped. It became soft, lethal. "It is not his actions. It is you. You have been like this since he was born. Cold, distant. You never bonded with him. Every time he acts out, every time he pushes boundaries, it is because he is desperate for your attention. He is begging for a mother, Victoria, and all he gets is a warden." The words hit me. They were precise. They were practiced. "I provide everything for him. I run this entire empire to secure his future. You run it for yourself. He knows you don't love him. I see it. The ranch hands see it. The whole town sees it. You are a brilliant businesswoman, Victoria, but you are a broken mother. You are damaging that boy. Your coldness is turning him into this. You are making him cruel." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned and walked past me. The door closed. I stayed in the tack room. The dust settled in the shafts of light. I looked at my hands. They were perfectly steady, but my mind was spinning in a dark circle. For 12 years, I had worn the label he gave me, the Ice Queen, worn the unnatural mother. It is a terrifying thing when the person closest to you tells you that your reality is wrong. In psychology, they call it the highest form of mental abuse. Gaslighting. He took my truth and twisted it. He made me doubt my own sanity. He made me question my basic human instinct. Why did I feel this massive gap between me and Leo? Why did every embrace feel stiff and forced? Why did my intuition scream at me every time I looked into his eyes? Julian told me it was my flaw. He convinced me that I was simply missing the maternal gene. He used my natural, intuitive disconnect with Leo to build a prison of guilt around me. He made me the villain in my own home. He played the generous, forgiving father to steal the boy's loyalty and mask his own agenda. I had spent years analyzing my own supposed failures, and I had spent nights staring at the ceiling, thinking I was completely broken inside. I believed that my inability to connect with the boy was a terrible moral failing on my part. But what if my instinct wasn't broken? What if the coldness wasn't a lack of love? What if it was a warning, an alarm bell ringing in the dark, a mother's intuition violently refusing to bond with a lie, a primal defense mechanism protecting me from a creature that did not belong to my bloodline? Julian weaponized my own intuition against me. He used my guilt to blind me to his moves. The tragedy wasn't just that I felt like a bad mother. The real tragedy was that I had surrendered my right to trust my own judgment for over a decade. I walked out of the tack room. The Wyoming wind hit my face. It was biting. It cleared my head. I looked toward the main house. I didn't feel broken anymore. I felt something much more dangerous. I felt awake. 2 days later, Julian left for a Cattlemen's Association meeting in Denver. He would be gone for the weekend. The ranch was quiet. I spent the morning reviewing the winter feed contracts. Around noon, my radio crackled. It was Elias. Leo had taken his horse to the South Ridge. He pushed the animal too hard over the rocky terrain. The horse balked. Leo was thrown. I drove the truck out to the ridge. The dust billowed behind the tires. I found him sitting in the dirt. He was holding his right shoulder. He was crying. When he saw my truck, he tried to swallow the tears. He wanted to look tough. He failed. I parked and got out. I walked over and checked his collarbone. It wasn't broken, just a deep bruise. He winced when I pressed the skin. Get in the truck. And we are going to the clinic. I am fine. Dad wouldn't make me go. Your father is in Denver. Get in the truck, Leo. He didn't argue further. He climbed into the passenger seat. He slouched against the window. We drove in silence. I didn't take him to the local doctor in town. People talk too much. The Thorne family does not show weakness in our own backyard. I drove 50 miles to a private clinic in Sheridan. The highway stretched out, a long gray ribbon cutting through the plains. The sky was a pale, hard blue. Leo stared out the window. I kept my hands tight on the steering wheel. I didn't offer comforting words. I didn't say it would be okay. I just drove. The clinic in Sheridan was quiet. It smelled of bleach and old magazines. I filled out the insurance forms at the front desk. A young doctor took Leo back for an x-ray. And then I sat down in a stiff vinyl chair. I took out my phone to check the grain market prices. Excuse me, Mrs. Thorne. I looked up. An older woman stood near the coffee station. She had short gray hair. She wore a thick wool cardigan. Her eyes were sharp and observant behind wire-rimmed glasses. I locked my phone. I stood up. Yes. Do I know you? She smiled. It was a warm, nostalgic smile. You wouldn't remember my face, not from that night. I am Martha Higgins. I used to be the head delivery nurse at the old county hospital, before they shut it down. I stared at her. The memories of that night were a fragmented nightmare. 12 years ago, a massive blizzard had locked down the entire state. The roads were buried under 3 feet of snow. I went into early labor. Julian had to drive the truck through a whiteout to get me to the hospital. There was no power. The backup generators were failing. It was chaos, pain, bright lights, and then nothing. Yes, the blizzard. It was a difficult night. Martha nodded. She stepped a little closer. Difficult is an understatement. We almost lost you both. Your blood pressure was off the charts. We had to do an emergency section. I stayed by your side the whole time. You were unconscious when it was over. I offered a polite, professional nod, the kind I use to end a conversation with a supplier. Well, thank you for your service that night, Martha. It is a long time ago. Martha kept smiling. Her eyes crinkled at the corners. It stays with you. A night like that. I recognized your name on the patient log today. I just had to come out and say hello. Tell me, how is she doing? The clinic waiting room was completely silent. The hum of the vending machine in the corner suddenly sounded very loud. How is who doing? The baby, the little girl. She was so tiny, barely 4 pounds, but she had a set of lungs on her, a real fighter. She screamed the moment we pulled her out. My chest tightened. The air in the room felt incredibly thin. I looked at Martha. I searched her face for a sign of confusion, for a sign of dementia. Her eyes were perfectly clear. You are mistaken, Martha. I had a boy, Leo. He is 12 years old. He is in the back getting an X-ray right now. Martha frowned. The warm smile vanished. She tilted her head. She looked at me with absolute certainty. No, I am not mistaken, Mrs. Thorne. I have delivered hundreds of babies, but I don't forget the ones from the blizzard. And I weighed her myself. I wrapped her in the blanket myself. It was a girl. My husband was there. He saw the boy. The records say it was a boy. Martha shook her head slowly. Her voice dropped. It became a harsh whisper. Your husband was in the waiting room until the shift change. The power went out right after the delivery. It was total darkness for 10 minutes, total confusion. But I know what I held in my hands. I signed the initial birth log, female. My fingers went numb. A low, violent ringing started in my ears. I took a step back. That is impossible. You are confusing me with someone else. Martha opened her mouth to speak again. The door to the examination area swung open. Leo walked out. The young doctor was behind him. Just a deep tissue contusion, Mrs. Thorne. No fractures. Keep his arm in a sling for a few days, and he will be fine. Leo looked at me. Then he looked at the old woman. He rolled his pale blue eyes. He slouched toward the exit. Can we go now? This place smells gross. Martha looked at Leo. She looked at his face, his posture. Then she looked back at me. I saw the realization hit her, the absolute terrifying certainty in her eyes. She knew. She knew the boy standing there was not the infant she had pulled from my body. I didn't say goodbye to Martha. I turned and walked out the glass doors. The cold Wyoming air hit my lungs like shards of glass. I started the truck. Leo climbed in. He immediately put his headphones on. He stared out the window. I drove out of Sheridan. The tires hummed on the asphalt. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, but my mind was breaking apart. I replayed Martha's words. Over and over, I rapped her myself. Oh, and it was a girl. I glanced at Leo in the passenger seat. I looked at his hands. I looked at the shape of his jaw. Julian had always said Leo had my stubbornness. But right now, in the harsh afternoon light, I saw nothing of myself in him. Not a single trace. Julian was alone in the hospital during the blackout. Julian had handled all the paperwork while I was sedated for 2 days. Julian had placed the baby in my arms when I finally woke up. The numbers in my head began to shift. The ledger was wrong. A massive, catastrophic error had been made 12 years ago. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I was not going to panic. I was going to do what I always do. I was going to find the missing data, and I was going to balance the books. I did not scream when I walked through the heavy oak doors of the ranch house. I did not throw things. Hysterics are the weapon of the weak. I walked directly into the kitchen. Julian was leaning against the marble counter. He was holding a mug of coffee. He asked about the trip to the clinic. He asked if Leo was in pain. It is just a deep bruise, Julian. He will be fine. I kept my voice completely flat. I poured a glass of ice water. I looked at the man leaning against my counter, the handsome, beloved cowboy, the liar. He smiled his perfect smile. He told me I looked tired. He told me to go rest. I nodded. I walked upstairs to my study. I closed the door and turned the heavy brass lock. I opened my secure laptop. I needed a professional. I did not use the ranch's regular security team. They were loyal to the Thorne payroll, but they drank beer with Julian on the weekends. I needed absolute silence. When I contacted an independent private investigator based out of Cheyenne, a former state trooper named Vance. I typed a brief, encrypted message. I needed full, round-the-clock surveillance on Julian Thorne, bank records, burner phone logs, physical tracking, no contact with the target. I authorized a blank check for his retainer. Vance replied in exactly 8 minutes. Acknowledged. Starting now. For the next 3 days, I played my part. I managed the winter feed contracts. I sat at the head of the long dining table. I watched Julian play the benevolent father. I watched Leo play the sullen, misunderstood son. It was a flawless performance. On Thursday afternoon, my phone vibrated. A location pin from Vance. It was miles outside the town limits, deep near the edge of the northern pine forest. Julian had told me he was taking Leo to inspect the boundary fences. I grabbed my keys. I bypassed my usual SUV. I took an old, rusted farm truck used by the Hands. It would blend in. I drove for nearly an hour. The paved highway turned to packed gravel. The gravel turned to loose dirt. The tall pines grew thick, blocking out the afternoon sun. The shadows stretched long and dark across the windshield. I slowed down. I pulled the truck off the dirt road, hiding it behind a dense cluster of evergreens. I walked the final half mile on foot. It was a run-down tavern, a rusted tin roof and neon beer signs buzzing in the dim light. A dozen muddy pickup trucks were scattered in the dirt lot. Julian's truck was parked near the back entrance. I did not walk through the front door. I moved silently through the tree line. And I found a vantage point in the deep shadows near a side window. The glass was covered in years of grime, but I could see clearly. The tavern was mostly empty. They were sitting in a worn leather booth in the far corner. Julian, Leo, and a woman. I knew her face. Ruby. She owned this place. A woman with sharp features and bleached blonde hair. Julian had his arm draped casually over the back of the booth. His fingers were brushing Ruby's shoulder. It was an intimate, possessive gesture. Leo was sitting across from them. He was not scowling. He was not rolling his eyes or acting like the victim. He was laughing. A bright, genuine laugh I had never heard echo in the halls of my own house. Julian reached into his heavy leather jacket. He pulled out a small, shiny object, a silver harmonica. He handed it across the table to Leo, and the boy's face lit up with pure joy. Julian reached over and ruffled the boy's hair, the great generous father rewarding his son. But it was the woman who froze the blood in my veins. Ruby was not looking at Julian. She was looking entirely at Leo. She reached across the sticky wooden table. She gently wiped a smudge of dirt from the boy's cheek. It was a simple, automatic gesture. Her eyes were completely soft. They were filled with an absolute, unfiltered pride. It was not the polite look of a bartender entertaining a customer's kid. It was the look of a mother watching her own flesh and blood. It was the exact look Julian accused me of lacking. The look I had tried and failed to summon for 12 years. The final pieces snapped together in my mind. The jagged edges fit perfectly. The blizzard, the blackout in the delivery ward, or the missing medical records. Julian had not just swapped my baby for some random orphan in the chaos. He had swapped my baby for his own bastard son. He brought his mistress's child into my home. He used my wealth to feed him. He used my ranch to secure his future. And he let me believe I was a defective monster for not feeling a maternal bond. I stood perfectly still in the freezing Wyoming wind. I watched the fake family through the dirty glass. Leo blew a sharp, discordant note on the silver harmonica. Julian and Ruby laughed together. I did not feel heartbreak. Heartbreak is for victims. I felt the cold, hard steel of the Thorne legacy locking into place in my spine. They were celebrating a victory in the dark. They thought I was just the cold, blind wife paying the bills. I stepped backward into the shadows of the pines, and I walked back to the rusted truck. I started the engine. The time for silent observation was over. I had the narrative. Now I needed the undeniable science to destroy it. Vance's report on the tavern was a heavy blow, a clear picture of Julian, Ruby, and the boy laughing together. But in my world, in the business of running a 50,000-acre empire, visual confirmation is never enough to execute a hostile takeover. Julian could claim they were just talking. He could claim Ruby was an old friend of the family. He could hire a slick lawyer from Cheyenne to bury Martha's old medical logs in endless red tape. He could stand in front of a judge and gaslight the entire courtroom, exactly like he gaslighted me for 12 years. I needed a truth that could not be twisted by a charming smile. I needed hard data. Numbers never lie. So, when I needed a DNA test. The next morning, the house was perfectly quiet. The sun was not even up over the ridge. Julian was still asleep in the master bedroom. Leo was asleep down the hall. I walked down the long corridor. The wooden floorboards were freezing under my bare feet. I opened the door to Leo's bedroom. The room smelled of expensive leather and unwashed clothes. I moved to his private bathroom. I did not turn on the overhead light. I used the faint blue glow from the window. I opened the glass cabinet over the sink. I took his toothbrush. I placed it carefully inside a sterile plastic bag. I walked back to his heavy oak bed. He was snoring softly. His face was relaxed. I found 3 loose hairs on his white pillowcase. I picked them up with a pair of metal tweezers. I sealed them in a second bag. I left the room like a ghost. Vance had already pulled the county records on the abandoned infant from the night of the blizzard 12 years ago. She was placed in the state system. She was bounced around from foster home to foster home. Now she was at a county orphanage that doubled as a wild horse rescue. It was 30 miles east of the Thorne property. Her name was Maya. I drove my truck to the rescue center that afternoon. The Wyoming wind was kicking up a thick cloud of dust along the highway. I parked near the weathered wooden corrals. I saw her immediately, a 12-year-old girl. She was wearing faded jeans and a torn flannel shirt. She was brushing down a nervous, massive gray mare. She had dark hair. She had my exact posture. Her movements were sharp and efficient. I did not approach her as a weeping mother. And I approached her as a wealthy donor making a routine inspection. I spoke briefly to the center director. I handed over a generous check. Then I walked out to the corral. The afternoon sun was brutal. I brought 2 bottles of cold mineral water from my cooler. I leaned against the heavy wooden fence. "You handle that horse well." She didn't look at me. She kept brushing the gray coat. "She just needs a firm hand. People around here coddle them too much. They think sweet talk fixes a broken animal." I held out a water bottle. "You look thirsty." She hesitated. She stopped brushing. She wiped her dirty forehead with the back of her sleeve. Her eyes scanned me. Grayish-green eyes. My eyes. She took the bottle. She twisted the plastic cap off and drank deeply. She handed it back to me. "Thanks." When she turned her back to me and went right back to the horse. I held the bottle by the very bottom edge. I walked back to my truck. I sealed the bottle in a 3rd plastic bag. I drove straight to a private courier office in the next town. I shipped the packages to a top-tier private laboratory in Manhattan. I used a fake corporate name. I paid triple the standard fee for a 48-hour emergency rush. For 2 long days, I sat at my dining table. I ate steak with the man who stole my daughter. I listened to the complaints of the boy who was put in her place. I nodded. I smiled politely. I signed feed contracts. My hands did not shake. I did not scream. I waited. On Saturday night, the encrypted email arrived. I was in my study. The ranch was completely silent outside the dark window. I clicked the secure link, and I entered the 32-character passcode. The document loaded slowly on the screen. The black text was as sharp as a knife. Probability of maternity. Sample A, Leo, 0.00%. Probability of maternity. Sample B, Maya, 99.99%. My lungs expanded. I took a deep, cold breath. The years of agonizing self-doubt evaporated in a single second. The intuition I had buried under a mountain of guilt was finally vindicated by cold, hard science. The piece of paper on my screen was not just a medical result, it was a death warrant. The game of hiding was over. I had my weapon. Now, I just needed to plan the execution. Sunday evening. The long mahogany dining table felt like a battlefield. Julian was not due back from Denver until Monday. It was just Leo and me. And the housekeeper had served roasted lamb. The only sound was the clinking of silver forks against porcelain plates. The grand clock in the hallway ticked. A heavy, rhythmic sound. I chewed my food slowly. I watched him. He was 12 years old, a child, but the DNA results on my encrypted laptop had stripped away the illusion of innocence. I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. I needed to know how deep Julian's poison had seeped into his veins. I set my knife down. The silver made a sharp tap on the table. I was reviewing the estate files this afternoon, Leo. He didn't look up from his plate. So what? You are always reviewing files. I am updating the trust documents. I had to run a background check on some old properties near the northern pine forest. I drove out there on Thursday. His fork stopped moving. Just for a fraction of a second. It was a microscopic pause, but I saw it. I stopped at a rundown tavern near the edge of the woods. I met the owner, a blonde woman. Her name was Ruby. He shoved a piece of meat into his mouth. He chewed fast. He kept his eyes fixed on the table. Never heard of it. I picked up my water glass. The condensation felt cold against my palm. That is strange, because she had a silver harmonica sitting behind the bar. It looked exactly like the one you keep in the top drawer of your nightstand, the one you play when you think I am not listening. His head snapped up. His pale blue eyes were wide. The panic flashed bright and hot. Dad bought me that. He bought it at a store in Cheyenne. I leaned forward. I rested my forearms on the cold mahogany. Did he, or did she give it to you? He dropped his fork, and it clattered loudly onto his plate. He pushed his chair back. The wood scraped harshly against the floor. You are crazy. Dad just takes me out there to get away from you, because you are miserable. I didn't blink. I didn't raise my voice. I kept my tone perfectly flat. Lethal. Does he take you to get away from me, Leo, or does he take you to see your mother? I waited for the shock. I waited for the confusion of a child whose entire universe had just been violently shattered. I waited for him to call me a liar. I waited for the tears. They didn't come. Instead, his posture went rigid. His hands balled into fists at his sides. The panic in his eyes vanished. It was replaced by something entirely different. It was the calculated, defensive glare of a cornered thief. He wasn't shocked by the information. He was shocked that I knew. And I stood up. I walked slowly around the long table. The silence in the dining room was deafening. I stopped 2 feet away from him. You are not surprised. He stared at the floor. He breathed heavily through his nose. I reached out. I grabbed his chin with my thumb and forefinger. I forced his face up. I forced him to look into my eyes. When did you find out? He ripped his face away from my grip. He took a step back. Don't touch me. Tell me when you found out, Leo, before I lock you in this room and dismantle everything you own. His chest heaved. The childish facade cracked completely. The ugly truth spilled out. Last year. Okay, I knew last year. I felt a cold wave wash over me. A year, 365 days of sitting across from me. How? He crossed his arms. He lifted his chin. A defiant, my arrogant gesture copied perfectly from Julian. Dad left the keys to Ruby's safe on the bar counter. He was drinking. I opened it. I wanted to see what she hid in there. I found the papers, the birth certificate, my real name, her name. I stared at the 12-year-old boy. The implications crashed down like stones. You knew she was your biological mother. You knew Julian smuggled you into my house, and you said nothing. He glared at me. The entitlement radiated from his small frame. Why would I say anything? Ruby lives in a dump. She smells like cheap beer and cigarettes. I belong here. Dad said if we just played along, the ranch would go into my trust. I took a slow, deep breath. You played along. You watched Julian call me a monster. You watched me doubt my own sanity. You treated me like garbage. All to secure the Thorne inheritance. It is mine. You don't even like me. Dad says I deserve it. I looked at him. Really looked at him. He was not a hostage. He was not an innocent victim of a twisted adult game. He was a willing accomplice. He had weighed the truth against the value of 50,000 acres of Wyoming land, and he had chosen the land. The corruption was already set deep in his bones. He was Julian's masterpiece. I turned my back on him. I walked back to my chair. I picked up my napkin and placed it on the table. Go to your room, Leo. You can't take it from me. Dad will stop you. I looked over my shoulder. My eyes were dead. Your father cannot even stop himself. Go to your room. He stomped up the stairs. His heavy footsteps echoed in the vast, empty house. I stood alone in the dining room, and the final piece of the puzzle was in place. The enemy was not just the man I married. The enemy was the boy I had raised. There would be no mercy left in me, not a single drop. Tuesday evening. The house was quiet. The annual Wyoming State Livestock Auction was exactly 48 hours away. It is the single most important event of the year for the Thorne family, a time for handshakes, whiskey, and securing political alliances. Julian loved the auction. He loved the spotlight. I found him in my study. He was standing by the antique globe, pouring himself a generous measure of my father's bourbon. He looked completely relaxed. He wore a crisp blue shirt that brought out the color of his eyes. He smiled when I walked in. "Good evening, Victoria. You have been working late." I did not smile back. I stepped inside the room, and I closed the heavy oak door behind me. I reached down and turned the brass lock. The heavy click echoed loudly in the silent room. Julian paused. The crystal decanter hovered over his glass. What is with the lock? I walked over to my massive mahogany desk. I carried a thick manila folder. I dropped it flat onto the polished wood. The sound was like a gunshot. I read the draft from the lawyers, Julian, the trust documents you commissioned. He set the decanter down. He picked up his glass. He took a slow sip. He was trying to buy time. He was trying to construct his mask. I told you I was having them look at it. It is just a standard transfer. For Leo's future, for his security. I kept my hands flat on the desk. My voice was perfectly level. It is not a standard transfer. It is a hostile takeover disguised as paternal care. Well, you drafted a clause that names you as the sole, uncontested trustee until Leo turns 25. You also included a provision that allows the trustee to borrow heavily against the lower basin water rights, without my consent, without the board's approval. His jaw tightened. The easy, charming smile vanished. You are misinterpreting the legal jargon, Victoria. It is standard protection. It is theft. You plan to bleed the water rights dry. You plan to leverage the core of the Thorne Empire to line your own pockets, and you used a 12-year-old boy as your Trojan horse. He slammed his glass down on the table. The bourbon splashed over the rim. You are paranoid. You see enemies in your own shadow. I am your husband. I am trying to build a safety net for our son, and you treat me like a criminal. I did not flinch, and I opened the manila folder. I pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was printed on heavy official stock. I fired those lawyers this morning. I hired new ones in Cheyenne. This is a post-nuptial agreement. It is a complete, unconditional forfeiture." Julian stared at the paper. "By signing this, you surrender any and all claims to the Thorne estate. You surrender all voting rights, all proxy power, and all access to the corporate accounts. You waive any claim to the water rights, the livestock, and the land." He let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "You are out of your mind. I am not signing that. You cannot force me to give up my legal rights as your husband." I reached into the folder again. I pulled out a second stack of papers. Bank records. Vance had done his job perfectly. "Over the last 3 years, you have siphoned exactly $450,000 from the Equipment Maintenance Fund. You routed it through 3 dummy LLCs. I know exactly where the money went. I have the wire transfers. I have the signatures." The color drained entirely from his face. His blue eyes darted frantically around the room, as if looking for an exit. "Sign the forfeiture, Julian. Sign it right now, or I will unlock that door, pick up the phone, and call the state police. You will be arrested for corporate fraud and grand larceny before the sun goes down." He stared at the bank records. He was breathing hard. He looked at me. The hatred in his eyes was naked and ugly. But then I saw the calculation begin. I saw his mind working. He looked at the locked door. He thought about the state auction in 2 days. He thought about my pride. He believed he understood my psychology perfectly. Victoria Thorne would never suffer a public scandal. Victoria Thorne would never let the Western elite see her dirty laundry. He reasoned that I was doing this quietly in a locked room to save face. He reasoned that if he signed, he would lose his control of the ranch, but he would keep his freedom. He would keep his status as my husband. He would still live in the mansion. He would still play the wealthy cowboy. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. His arrogant smirk slowly returned. "You are making a huge mistake, Victoria. But if a piece of paper makes you feel secure, fine. I will sign your ridiculous document. I am doing this to keep the peace in this family, because unlike you, I actually care about our home." He picked up the gold pen from my desk. When he didn't even read the forfeiture document, he just scrawled his name at the bottom. He threw the pen down. "There. Are you happy now? You protected your precious dirt." I picked up the document. I checked the signature. It was legally binding. It was perfect. "Yes, Julian, I am perfectly happy." He scoffed. He grabbed his coat from the chair. "I am going to the guest room. I will see you at the auction on Friday. Try to pretend you are a normal human being for the cameras." He unlocked the door and walked out. He felt incredibly smug. He thought he had survived the storm. He thought the worst was over. He thought the family facade was entirely intact. I stood alone in the study. I carefully placed the forfeiture agreement into the heavy iron safe behind my desk. I closed the metal door and spun the dial. Julian thought I was a proud woman terrified of a public scandal. He had no idea that I was a mother who had lost 12 years of her daughter's life. I was not going to hide his sins to protect my pride. I was going to broadcast them to the entire world. The first chain was locked. The trap was ready to snap shut. I had his signature. I had the DNA results. I had the photographs. The logical next step was to pick up the phone on my desk, to call the county sheriff, to have Julian and his mistress arrested quietly before the sun came up. I didn't touch the phone. I left it sitting on the mahogany wood. A quiet arrest is a survivable wound. In the world of Wyoming land barons, morality is not the ultimate currency. Reputation is. Social capital is everything. If I handed Julian over to the police in private, the story would leak slowly. He would hire a slick crisis manager from Denver. He would spin the narrative. He would sit in the local tavern and play the tragic, misunderstood victim. He would tell his powerful friends that his cold, barren wife had finally snapped and framed him. They would believe him. They would pity him. He would lose his legal claim to the ranch, but he would keep his standing in the community. He would survive. To kill a monster that feeds on public adoration, you cannot drag it into the shadows. You have to drag it into the blinding light. You have to expose the rot so thoroughly that its own kind recoils in disgust. You have to force the elite to tear it apart. The Wyoming State Livestock Auction was exactly 2 days away. It is held every year in the Grand Pavilion in Cheyenne. It is not just about selling prime cattle. It is a massive political and social stage. The governor attends. The state senators attend. Every billionaire who owns a blade of grass in the state is in that room. The Thorne family always sponsors the main event. It is our night. Julian loved the auction. He'd already bought a new custom suit for it. He loved the spotlight. I decided to give it to him. I drove back to Cheyenne on Wednesday afternoon. I met Vance in a diner off the interstate. I slid a heavy manila envelope across the Formica table. It contained $10,000 in unmarked cash. I need full, unrestricted access to the audio-visual system at the main pavilion on Friday night. Vance took the envelope. He didn't open it. He just slipped it inside his heavy jacket. That is a high-security setup, Mrs. Thorne. If the auction house brings in their own tech crew. Buy the crew. Bribe the manager. Do whatever it takes. I need a direct feed to the main projector, and I need a wireless remote that fits in the palm of my hand. He nodded slowly. His eyes were hard. You will have it. I handed him a black USB drive. The files are labeled in numerical order. Do not open them. Just load them into the system and give me the trigger. The drive contained everything. I had spent the entire night formatting the presentation with cold precision. Slide 1 was the original, altered birth log from the hospital. Slide 2 was the clean, undeniable DNA report from the Manhattan lab. Slide 3 contained the high-resolution photos Vance had taken at the tavern. Julian, Ruby, Leo, the fake happy family. Slide 4 was an audio clip. I had Vance pull the security feed from the tavern's back room. The audio was slightly grainy, but the voices were entirely clear. Julian bragging about the trust fund. Ruby laughing about my ignorance. The complete, undeniable architecture of their betrayal. Thursday night. The ranch house was tense. Julian avoided me entirely. He stayed in the guest room. He thought he had won a bitter, private negotiation. He thought the signed forfeiture was the end of the war. I walked past his open door. He was packing his leather garment bag. He was carefully selecting his silk ties. He was preparing to walk into the pavilion and shake hands with the governor. He was preparing to play the king. I walked into my own closet. I bypassed the usual neutral business colors. I chose a dress, black silk, severe, tailored to absolute perfection. I selected a pair of diamond earrings my father gave me before he died. I looked at myself in the full-length mirror. My face was pale. My dark eyes were completely flat. There was no trace of the woman who had cried in the dark, wondering why she could not love her own son. That woman was dead. I was the heir to the Thorne Empire. I was a mother who had been robbed of 12 years. Tomorrow the Thorne name would be dragged through the mud. The legacy would be stained with a massive public scandal. But a broken bone must be reset before it can heal. You have to break it cleanly. You have to endure the scream. I turned off the light in the closet. The sword was drawn. It was time to swing it. The Cheyenne Pavilion smelled of premium leather, roasted beef, and expensive cologne. The grand arena was packed. It was a sea of Stetson hats, or diamond necklaces, and tailored suits. The governor was sitting in the VIP box. The state senators were gathered near the front rails. This was the absolute apex of Wyoming high society. Julian was in his element. He wore a charcoal suit that was perfectly cut to his broad shoulders. He stood near the main aisle, shaking hands. He laughed loudly. He clapped older men on the back. He kissed the hands of their wives. He was the golden boy of the Thorne Empire. He thought his secrets were safely locked away in a rusty tavern and a signed piece of paper. He had no idea he was standing on a trap door. I looked toward the upper tier of the bleachers. The shadows were deep up there, but I saw her. Ruby. She wore a bright red dress that screamed for attention. She was sipping champagne from a plastic cup, and she had snuck in to watch her lover's ultimate triumph. She was waiting for the day I would be pushed aside. The auctioneer's voice echoed through the massive speakers. The bidding was fierce. The gavel struck the wooden block. A sharp, violent crack. Sold to the gentleman from Casper. The crowd applauded politely. The auctioneer stepped back. The announcer's voice took over. Ladies and gentlemen, we now invite the owner of the Thorne Estate to present this year's keynote address. Please welcome Mrs. Victoria Thorne. The applause swelled. Julian turned and looked at me. He smiled. He raised his hand and gestured toward the stage. A perfectly supportive husband. I walked down the center aisle. My black silk dress moved silently over the concrete floor. My heels clicked in a steady, measured rhythm, and I climbed the wooden stairs to the podium. The bright white spotlight hit my face. The entire arena fell silent. Thousands of eyes were fixed on me. I adjusted the microphone. I rested my left hand on the edge of the wooden podium. My right hand was inside my clutch. My thumb found the small plastic button of the wireless remote. Good evening. The Thorne legacy was built on dirt, sweat, and absolute truth. My father always said you cannot build a lasting structure on a rotten foundation. Tonight, we are going to look at the foundation of this estate. I pressed the button. The massive LED screen behind me flickered. The Thorne logo vanished. A scanned document appeared. It was 50 feet wide. The faded ink and the altered checkboxes were glaringly obvious. 12 years ago, during the Great Blizzard, I gave birth in a darkened hospital ward. The records were altered. The signature was forged. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. The governor leaned forward in his seat. Julian's smile froze on his face. His hands dropped to his sides. I pressed the button a second time. The screen changed. The DNA lab report flashed in high definition. The red text highlighted the 0 probability. My husband Julian bribed a nurse to steal my daughter. He replaced her with his own illegitimate son. He brought a stranger into my home, and he let my flesh and blood be thrown into the state foster system. The murmur turned into a sharp gasp. The collective shock of 100 billionaires. I did not stop. I pressed the button again. The high-resolution photographs filled the screen. Julian sitting in the dirty tavern, and his hand resting intimately on Ruby's shoulder. Leo laughing across the table. He did not do this alone. He did this with his mistress, a woman who is currently sitting in the upper tier of this very pavilion. Heads snapped upward. Hundreds of faces turned to look at the shadows. Ruby dropped her plastic cup. The champagne spilled over the concrete steps. She tried to back away, but the crowd physically recoiled from her, leaving her isolated in the light. I pressed the final button. The audio file played through the concert-grade speakers. The sound of Julian's voice, clear and arrogant, washed over the silent crowd. She doesn't suspect a thing. The water rights will be ours. Just play the loving husband a little longer. The recording clicked off. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a suffocating, heavy vacuum. I looked down at Julian. He was gripping the metal railing of the front row. His knuckles were bone white. His face was the color of ash. He looked around the room. He looked at his powerful friends. The men who had just shaken his hand were staring at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. They wiped their palms on their trousers. The elite society he worshipped had just rejected him like a diseased animal. His social capital was dead. The heavy double doors at the back of the pavilion swung open with a loud crash. Sheriff Vance walked in. He was no longer a private investigator. He was wearing his full state trooper uniform. He was flanked by 4 armed deputies. They marched down the center aisle. The heavy thud of their boots was the only sound in the massive arena. They did not look at me. They walked straight to the front row. Julian Thorne, you are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and child abduction. Julian did not run. He did not argue. His legs simply gave out. A deputy grabbed his arm and hauled him upright. The cold steel cuffs clicked loudly around his wrists. In the upper tier, 2 more deputies grabbed Ruby. She started to scream, a shrill, pathetic sound that echoed off the high ceiling. They dragged her down the concrete stairs. I stood at the podium. I watched them march Julian down the long aisle. He looked back at me over his shoulder. His eyes were completely hollow. He had lost the ranch. He had lost his freedom. But worst of all, he had lost his mask. The golden cowboy was dead. I stepped back from the microphone. I turned and walked off the stage. The trap had snapped shut. The books were balanced. Now, the drive back to the ranch took 2 hours. I drove the SUV. Leo sat in the passenger seat. He didn't wear his headphones. He didn't look out the window. He stared straight ahead at the dark asphalt. The silence in the car was absolute. It was the silence of a structure that had been completely demolished. When we walked through the heavy oak doors, the house felt enormous and entirely empty. The staff had gone to their quarters. There was no Julian leaning against the counter. There was no mediator. There was no lie left to uphold. Leo stopped in the middle of the grand foyer. He looked around. His shoulders slumped. He looked incredibly small. The arrogant 12-year-old heir was gone. He was replaced by a terrified child whose entire universe had just collapsed. He didn't run to his room. He didn't scream. And he slowly sank down onto the bottom step of the grand staircase. He pulled his knees to his chest. He started to cry. It was not a tantrum. It was a choked, desperate sob. The sound echoed painfully in the silent house. I stood by the door. I looked at him. The cold, mechanical rage that had fueled me for the past week suddenly halted. For 12 years, I'd looked at this boy as an invader. I had looked at him as the living embodiment of my failure. And recently, I had looked at him as a willing accomplice, a miniature version of the enemy. But sitting on the stairs, crying in the dark, he was none of those things. He was just a 12-year-old boy, a boy whose father had used him as a pawn, a boy whose mother had agreed to sell him for the promise of a Wyoming empire. Julian and Ruby had not just stolen my daughter, and they had actively destroyed their own son. They had weaponized his childhood. They had taught him that love was a transaction. They had forced him to wear a heavy, toxic armor of arrogance just to survive the lie. I walked over. My boots made no sound on the thick rug. I sat down on the step next to him. I kept a careful distance. I did not reach out. I did not offer a hug. An embrace would be a lie, and there would be no more lies in this house. He didn't look at me. He just kept crying into his knees. I am incredibly angry, Leo. My voice was quiet. It lacked the usual sharp edge, but I am beginning to understand. You are as much a victim of their greed as I am. You were drafted into a cruel game before you were even old enough to understand the rules. He slowly lifted his head. His eyes were swollen. His face was wet with tears. And he looked at me. The fear was stark and naked. Are you going to send me away? The question hung in the cold air. It was the logical conclusion. He had no legal right to be here. He had no biological claim to the Thorne name. I looked at the massive portrait of my father hanging above the staircase. I cannot suddenly love you as my own son, Leo, and you cannot suddenly love me. The damage is too deep. His shoulders dropped further. He braced himself for the sentence. But I will not throw you out into the street. I will not send you back to a woman who agreed to trade you for cash. You will stay here. But the rules are changing. Entirely. He wiped his nose with the back of his sleeve. He was listening intently. There is no trust fund anymore. There is no guaranteed inheritance. You are no longer the prince of the Thorn estate. From tomorrow morning, you are a worker on this ranch. You will attend school. You will muck stalls. You will repair fences. You will learn the value of labor, and you will learn how to earn respect without manipulating people." He stared at me. He was processing the reality of his new life. It was a harsh sentence, but it was not an exile. We are not starting over as mother and son. We are starting over as two people who have to figure out how to live in the wreckage left by Julian. I stood up. I smoothed the black silk of my dress. "Go wash your face. Your shift in the lower barn starts at 6 a.m. He didn't argue. He didn't complain about the work. He slowly stood up. He nodded once. It was a small, exhausted gesture of acceptance. He walked up the stairs. I watched him go. I didn't feel the warmth of a Hollywood ending. I felt the exhausting reality of the work ahead. I had kept the boy, not out of sudden affection, but out of a stubborn refusal to let Julian's poison win completely. I was going to break the toxic mold Julian had cast. I was going to force Leo to become a decent man. It was going to be brutal. It was going to take years. But the Thorn legacy was built on hard work, and the work was just beginning. A week later, the legal dust was settling over Cheyenne. I stood in the mudroom of the main house. I looked at the rows of expensive coats and imported shoes. I bypassed all of them. I put on a pair of dark leather riding boots, custom made, expensive. I walked out to the old tack room near the lower barn. I did not go to a luxury department store. I did not buy an expensive necklace. And I did not write a check. You cannot buy a feral animal's trust with paper. You earn it with sweat. I reached up to the highest rack. I took down a heavy, hand-tooled leather saddle. It belonged to my father. It smelled of old oil, dust, and hard miles. It was heavy. I carried it out to my truck. I dropped it into the rusted metal bed. I drove east toward the rescue center. The Wyoming plains stretched out in every direction. The sky was the color of bruised iron. The wind howled against the windows of the cab. I pulled into the dirt lot of the county orphanage. The wind whipped up a thick cloud of dry earth. I turned off the engine. I saw her immediately. She was in the far round pen, Maya. She was wearing faded jeans and a torn flannel shirt. She was working a wild Mustang. The horse was massive. Its coat was black as coal, and it reared up violently. Its front hooves struck the heavy wooden fence. The wood splintered with a loud crack. Maya held the thick nylon lead rope. Her boots dug deep into the loose mud. She was losing ground. The sheer weight of the animal was dragging her forward, but she did not let go. She did not drop the line. She did not call for help. Her jaw was set. I stepped out of the truck. I did not walk to the viewing rail to watch. I carried the heavy saddle on my shoulder. I unlatched the iron gate and walked directly into the pen. My boots sank deep into the wet, heavy mud. The dark earth coated the polished leather instantly, ruined in a matter of seconds. I didn't care. I dropped the saddle near the fence. I uncoiled a stiff lariat rope from my shoulder. The Mustang snorted loudly. It pinned its ears back flat against its skull. And it saw me as another threat. It lunged sideways. Maya looked at me. Her grayish-green eyes were wide with surprise. She was breathing hard. Sweat dripped down her dirty forehead. "What are you doing?" "You are holding the line too high, Maya. He has the leverage." She frowned. She dug her heels in harder. "I have him. I can break him." "You don't break a horse like this. You anchor him." I stepped right beside her. I didn't take her rope. I didn't push her out of the way. I threw my own loop. The lasso sailed through the dusty air. It landed perfectly over the Mustang's thick neck. I pulled the slack tight. The rope snapped straight. "Step to your left. Drop your center of gravity." She hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then she stepped left. She lowered her hips. The horse reared again. We pulled together, and the combined weight of two women held firm against the beast. The ropes groaned under the extreme tension. The dust rose in a blinding cloud around us. My bare hands burned. The rough nylon fibers bit deep into my palms. It was a sharp, grounding pain. I felt her small shoulder press tightly against mine. We adjusted our footing at the exact same time. We moved in complete unison, two silent parts of a single, unyielding machine. Hold him steady. Don't pull back. Let him find the end of the rope. The Mustang fought for another 10 agonizing minutes. It kicked the dirt. It tossed its heavy head. It spun in tight, angry circles. We held the center. We didn't speak another word. The only sounds were the frantic breathing of the animal and the heavy crunch of our boots shifting in the mud. Finally, the black horse stopped. It stood trembling in the center of the pen. It lowered its head toward the dirt. It exhaled a long, shuddering breath. It submitted. Not to violence, not to force, but to a boundary it could not break. Maya slowly slacked her rope. I kept mine steady. She walked slowly, carefully toward the animal. She reached out. She placed a small, dirty hand on its dark, sweating neck. The horse did not flinch. She turned and looked back at me. Her face was streaked with mud and sweat. My expensive boots were destroyed. My hands were bleeding. "Bring the saddle over, Maya." She nodded. She didn't question me. She walked to the edge of the fence. She picked up my father's heavy leather saddle. She carried it over to the horse. I stepped forward. We lifted the heavy leather together. We set it gently on the Mustang's back. Now, we didn't exchange tearful apologies. We didn't offer sweet, empty promises. We didn't force the word mother into the cold air. I reached under the horse's belly and grabbed the cinch strap. I handed the end of it to her. She pulled it tight. The leather creaked. The buckle locked into place. The foundation was set. Solid. Real. Unbreakable. 6 months passed. The winter snow melted off the high peaks. The green returned to the Wyoming valleys. The court proceedings were swift and merciless. Julian and Ruby both pleaded guilty. They had no money for a long defense. They had no social capital left to trade. They traded their freedom for a slightly reduced sentence. They were gone. The estate was secure. I am standing on the back porch of the main house. The sunset is painting the western sky in deep shades of purple and orange, with the long shadows stretch across the dirt. Down in the lower corral, I see Leo. He's not wearing a designer jacket. He is wearing faded denim and work boots. He is carrying a heavy bale of hay on his shoulder. He walks to the feed trough. He cuts the twine. He distributes the feed. His movements are tired, but they are steady. He does not complain. He does not look around for someone else to do the heavy lifting. He is learning. Out in the distance, near the North Ridge, I see a rider. It is Maya. She is sitting tall in the saddle of the massive black Mustang we broke together. She is not wearing a helmet. Her dark hair is loose in the wind. She rides with absolute confidence. She rides like she owns the land, and one day, she will. She has not called me Mom. She might never use the word, I do not care. We do not need a polite vocabulary. We have a shared language built on mud, sweat, and the unyielding tension of a nylon rope. I lean against the wooden rail. I look out over the 50,000 acres of the Thorn Empire. It is finally clean. The truth is a terrifying thing. It cuts down to the bone. It destroys the comfortable illusions we build to survive. Julian offered a family constructed of sweet, poisoned words. I dismantled it with cold, hard facts. But a house built on a lie is destined to collapse. It is only when you clear away the wreckage, when you stand in the absolute, brutal light of reality, that you can start to build something permanent. A family is not woven together with sweet promises. It is tied together with the sharp, honest friction of survival. I take a deep breath of the cold evening air. The air is clear. What about you? Do you think I was too cold when I kept the boy who lied to me? Do you think I should have cast Leo out to the streets along with his parents? Or is forcing him to earn his place, forcing him to face the brutal reality of honest labor, the ultimate form of revenge, or perhaps the only real form of salvation? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Let me know what you would do.